Chapter 11. Lower away, Svengal called. Slowly now. Easy does it. A little more. Olaf, take up the slack here. Bring him left. Hold it. A little more. That's it. Tug, suspended by a large canvas sling that passed under his belly, showed the whites of his eyes as he soared high into the air, then swung up over the empty space to be lowered gently into the last of the horse-holding pens that had been constructed in Wolfwind's midships. The wolf ship appeared at first glance to be nothing more than a large open boat, but Will knew this was a false impression. The central deck section that ran between the two rowing benches was actually comprised of three separate watertight compartments, which gave the ship buoyancy in the event that a wave swamped it. The large sealed compartments also served as a storage space for the booty that the crew liberated on raids. Now, one of these compartments was being used to accommodate the 3 ranger horses and Horace's battle horse, Kicker. The decking had been removed, and 4 small pens had been constructed for the horses. The job had been carried out so quickly and efficiently, it was obvious that the Scandians had done it before. The pens were tight fit, but that would be good if the ship struck bad weather. The horses would be less likely to fall in the case of extreme conditions. Svengal and his men prepared more canvas slings that would support the horses and prevent them from falling. Will slipped into the pen now with Tug and released the lifting sling that had been attached under his belly. He tied the little horse's halter to a ring in the front of the pen. Abelard, in the next pen, nickered in agreement. Tug looked at his master nervously. Horses aren't supposed to fly, he seemed to be saying. Will grinned, patted his nose, and gave him half of an apple. Good boy, he said. You won't be in here for long. The crew were dismantling the sheer legs that had assembled to lift the horses on board. A whole operation had gone smoothly. Kicker was the most highly strung of the horses, so he had gone aboard first. It was felt that he might panic at the sight of his brothers sailing in the air, legs dangling. If he didn't know that was coming, Halt said, he would be more likely to behave. As each horse was lowered into the shallow well in the deck, his rider was waiting with soothing words and reassurances. Will scratched Tug's ear one more time and climbed out of the pen. You've done this before, he said to Svengal. Since the Scandians didn't ride horses as a rule, there was only one explanation for it. Svengal grinned. Sometimes we come upon abandoned horses on the shore. It'd be cruel to leave them, so we take them on board until we can find them a good home. Abandoned, Will said. Svengal was wide-eyed and innocent. Well, nobody has ever asked for them back, he said. Then he added, besides, after what I've heard about Halt and the Temanjai horses, I wouldn't be making too big a fuss about it if I were you. Many years ago, Halt had borrowed some breeding stock from the Temanjai herds. The present-day ranger horses bore an unmistakable resemblance to those borrowed animals. Sad to say, Halt had yet to return them. Fair point, Will said. Then, glancing up at the dock, he said, Looks like we're almost ready to go. Cassandra and her father were approaching down the docks, followed by a small retinue of friends and officials. Duncan had his arm around his daughter's shoulder. His face showed his lingering concern over the wisdom of this trip. Cassandra, on the other hand, looked eager and alert. She was already feeling the many constraints of her life at the castle slipping away. In place of the stylish gowns she normally was required to wear, she wore tights, high-kneed boots, a woolen shirt, thigh-length belted jerkin, and a dagger at her belt, and carried a lightweight saber in her scabbard. Her other baggage followed behind, carried by 2 servants. The time she had spent in Scandia had taught Cassandra the value of traveling light. She beamed a greeting as she caught sight of Will and Horace leaning on the rail of the ship. The two boys grinned back at her. Svengal, with surprising agility for a man of his bulk, stepped lightly onto the rail of the ship, jumped ashore, and approached the royal pair. Out of deference to the king, he raised his knuckled hand to his brow in a salute. Duncan acknowledged the gesture with a quick nod of his head. It has to be said that Scandians weren't big on protocol and the necessities of court speech. Svengal was little at a loss on how he should address the king. The Scandians never called anyone sir, and that implied that the speaker was somehow inferior to the person he was addressing. Likewise, formal titles such as Your Majesty or My Lord didn't sit comfortably with the Northerners. In their own society, they solved the problem by using the other's position or title, Skirl, Jarl, or Oberjarl. No Scandian ever called Erak Sir or My Lord. If they wanted to show respect, they addressed him by the word that described what he was, Oberjarl. If that was good enough for his own ruler, Svengal thought it would be good enough for the Heirloom king. King, he said, you have a Scandian's gratitude for your help you're giving us. Duncan nodded again. It didn't seem necessary to say anything in reply. Svengal looked now at the slim blonde girl at the king's side. And I know how difficult it must be for you to send your daughter on a mission like this. I won't deny that I have misgivings, Captain, Duncan replied this time. Svengal nodded rapidly. Then, I give you my oath. My helmsman oath. You're familiar with the helmsman oath, King? I know no Scandian who would ever break it, Duncan said. That's true. Well, here is the oath, and it binds me and all my men. We will protect your daughter as if she were one of us. So long as one of us is alive, no harm will be allowed to come of her. There was a low growl of assent from the members of the crew, who had gathered at the ship's shoreward rail to watch the proceedings. Duncan looked around at their faces, scarred and weather-beaten, framed by their hair wrapped in untidy pigtails and surmounted by horned helmets. Duncan was a big man, but the Scandians were built on a massive scale. They were bulky, hard-muscled, and well-armed, and their faces showed one more thing: determination to uphold their leader's oath. For the first time in the past 3 days, he felt a little better about the whole situation. These men would never desert his daughter. They would fight tooth and nail to defend and protect her. He raised his voice a little so that his answer was aimed not just at Svengal, but the entire crew. Thank you, men of Wolfwind. I don't believe my daughter could be in better hands. The sincerity in his voice was obvious, and, again, there was a fierce growl of assent from the Scandians. One thing, however. I think from this point until you reach Al-Shabaab, it might be safer for Cassandra to travel incognito. She has decided to resume the name you most know her by, Evelyn. Will nudged Horace's ribs. Thank goodness for that. I could never get used to calling her Cassandra. I get tongue-tied around her when I'm thinking her as the princess. Horace grinned. It didn't bother him either way, but then, stationed at Heirloom as he was more used to seeing Cassandra on a day-to-day basis. Evelyn, as she would now be known, hugged her father one more time. They had already gone through a prolonged goodbye in private, and she glanced up at the pennant straining from the masthead, her personal pennant depicting a stooping red hawk. In which case, we'd better have that thing down for the time being, she said. As one of the crew moved to the halyards and lowered the flag, her father muttered to her, Make sure you get it back this time. I'm not sure I like the idea of a gang of freebooters sailing under your pennant. She grinned and touched his cheek with her hand. You're right. It could be embarrassing at a later date. She moved away from him and stepped lightly aboard the ship, taking Axel's hand to steady herself as she did so. Thank you, she said. He flushed and nodded. mumbling something indiscernible as she moved to the stern, where her companions were waiting. "Anything else?" Fengal asked, and Holt pointed to the east. "Let's get going," he said. "Right! Oars up!" Svengal's voice rose to the familiar, ear-shattering bellow that Scandian skirls used when giving orders. The rowing crew clattered onto the benches, retrieving their oars and raising the 3-meter-long oak poles vertically into the air. "Cast off and fend!" The line handlers cast off the bow and stern lines that had held Wolfwind fast to the jetty. At the same time, 3 other crewmen placed long poles against the timbers of the jetty and pushed the ship clear, setting it drifting out into the current. As the space between the ship widened, Svengal called his next order. "Down oars!" There was a prolonged clatter of wood on wood as 16 oars were slotted into their rowlocks, down the sides of the ship. The blades were cocked forward toward the bow, poised just above the water, ready for the first stroke. "Give way all!" Svengal ordered, seizing the tiller. The oars' blades dipped, and the rowers heaved themselves backwards against the oar handles. Wolfwind surged forward through the water, and the tiller came alive in his hand. The bow oarsman on the port side called for another stroke, and the speed increased as a small bow wave began to chuckle at the wolf ship's prow. They were under way at last.